Hello? Sorry. Don't. Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our November general meeting. I am Farzana Sedan, your current serving president. Today we have Monica Ali with us. Today we have Monica Ali with us as our guest speaker. Monica Ali is a best-selling writer whose work has been translated into 26 languages. She is the author of a number of novels, including critically acclaimed Brick Lane, and most recently, Love Marriage, which was an instant Sunday Times bestseller. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Literature and in 2003 was named as one of Granta's Best of Young British Novelists. She has been nominated for, amongst others, the Booker Prize, the George Orwell Prize, the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, and in the US has been a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. She has taught creative writing at Columbia University in New York, where she was a visiting professor, and from 2015 to 2018, she was Distinguished Writer in Residence at the University of Surrey. Monica, welcome to KCWC's November General Meeting. We are very honored to have you here with us.
Oh, well, thank you for inviting me. That was a very fulsome CV that you put forward there. Oh, dear.
Pardon?
Why don't we switch to the handheld mics? Farzana.
Is it not good, the sound? Okay. Can we switch to the handheld one, please? Yes? Okay.
I don't know how to switch that off.
Hello?
Yes.
Is it better? Okay, brilliant. Monica. Oh, this. Yeah.
Testing. Is that better? Yay.
Are we
We're
all
up and
settled
running.
now? Yes? Monica, you and I have something significant in common. We both were born in Dhaka, Bangladesh. But I was born after the Liberation War in 1971, and you were born before the Liberation War in 1971.
You're giving my age away.
So at that time, Bangladesh was called East Pakistan, and your father is Bangladeshi and your mother is English. How did they meet? Tell us a bit more about your family background.
Oh, the great romance of my parents. They met in Manchester when my dad was a student, and they met at a dance. So my father actually had an arranged marriage waiting for him back at home that his father had arranged. So he was betrothed, but he'd said, let me finish my studies, let me go to England, and I promise I'll marry this girl when I return. And then he met my mum. And the story goes, I mean, this is the legend anyway, that he only went along to the dance because his friend wanted to meet some girls, and my dad was just tagging along. And then he met my mum, and they liked each other, and they arranged to meet up, I don't know, the next week or something. They arranged a time and a date to meet. And my dad always said that he was quite worried that he wouldn't recognize her because all white girls looked more or less the same. But anyway, they found each other, or she found him, and they fell in love, I guess. And then my father had to go home and face the wrath of his father and his family, and his father. But that relationship never got mended. I mean, that was a huge family rift. my mum then followed him back to Dhaka about 6 months later. I mean, they knew each other in the UK for, I think, a relatively short period of time, like a few months. Mm-hmm. He went back. My mum followed him after 6 months. I mean, completely insane. And it's only funny if you ever met my mum, because she's so, mild-mannered and shy and reticent. And she did this completely crazy thing, following this man across the world. And then they got married, and they had my brother first, and then me, and then there was the Liberation War, Independence War in 1971, at which point, that was a horrific catastrophe for so many people. It's sort of unknown still exactly how many millions died in that war. My mother then came back to the UK with me and my brother. I was 3, my brother was 5. My father wasn't allowed to leave. It was a very dire situation. All the banks were shut. You couldn't take money out. You couldn't cross the border. My father managed to get across the border to India, to a refugee camp. We've still got the letters from my mother to the Home Office, and from the Home Office back to my mother, trying to get permission from my father to join us. So that took another 6-9 months. And my mother's parents were in Bolton, which is how we ended up in Bolton, because that's where we went first. And that's where I grew up. Yes. Sorry, that was a very long first answer.
That was very interesting, yes, because...
We will never get through the whole of my life at this rate.
So you came back to England when you were 3, and your father joined you later. How was it like growing up in a mixed family? What was like? Did one culture dominate the other?
It really is mixed. There weren't many Bangladeshis in the area that I grew up. It was predominantly white, and then there was an Asian community, largely Pakistani, a little bit further away. My father did have some Bengali friends, both from India and from Bangladesh. And we'd go to their houses, and it's now called code switching, right? It didn't have a term when I was growing up, but you learn to behave one way in one setting and a different way in another setting. So if you go to a Bengali home, it was normal, certainly then, that the men would eat first and they'd eat separately. And
yes.
the women,
That's strange, isn't it, Ila? When I go back home, is in some families, the men would eat first.
Yes.
And the women have to wait until the men finish their meal, and then the women will sit down together to eat later.
Exactly. So I think that will be shocking to, some people here, or they won't have heard of that before. But certainly, in a couple of the homes that we would visit, not in our home, but in a couple of homes that we visit, that's how it went. So there was that side, but predominantly, I grew up in a very white community. The school was very white. The secondary school that I went to, I got a free place at the local independent girls' school. That was very white at the time, not so much now, because I've been back. It's a bit more mixed. It was a bit of both. I only speak English, my first language, Bengali. I refused to speak it once we got to the UK, because I didn't want to be different. But food.
Yeah. Did you eat a lot of curry, or do you like curry?
No, and I still, it's still my favourite food. So there's certain cultural deep attachments, and then certainly the predominant culture for me was English culture.
Right. Okay. Then, talking about your writing, when did you first start? When did you first think like you wanted to be a writer, or when did you first started writing?
I was one of those kids who always had her head in a book. I didn't grow up in a home with lots of books, because books were certainly more expensive those days. We didn't have any money. But my mum would take me to the library every single weekend, and I just became a huge reader. And that was, it was an escape as well from pressures of life and, what was sometimes called a tense household. But I never thought that that was something that I would do. I mean, you don't make your living as a writer. Well, I did, but, it never seemed like a possibility. I think the first time, actually, that I got even an inkling that it was possible for someone like me to write a novel was when I read Buddha of Suburbia when I was in my 20s. I mean, I didn't act on it for some time, but Hanif is, his father is Pakistani and his mother is white English. And there he was writing this really raucous book about this young mixed race boy growing up in the suburbs of London and having a wild time. And that was the first time I thought, maybe it is possible. And then I didn't actually start writing until I had my first child. I started writing short stories, actually, which is not really my form. I mean, I have written short stories, a few since, so it's not really my form. But my son was a terrible sleeper. Oh, I don't know. Can I blame? That's not a fair thing to say about baby. I mean, babies wake up in the night, right? And then I couldn't get back to sleep. So I became a terrible sleeper. Mm-hmm. So the thing about insomnia is it's sort of like a vicious cycle, and the more you worry about it, the worse it gets. And I thought, let me try and do something constructive instead of fretting about not sleeping. So that's when I started writing short stories, when I couldn't sleep. And then when I had my second child, Shumi, when she was like a couple of months old, a few months old, my grandfather died, my maternal grandfather, and we went to his funeral, and then we went to the Lake District because we were up north for that, and we went to the Lake District for like a week or something like that, and I had been thinking about writing a novel by this stage. Mm-hmm. But it seemed like an insane thing to do with a toddler and a baby, and I didn't have any childcare. And anyway, there's something quite galvanizing about a funeral, if not now, when. Yeah. And I started on that trip. That's when I started what turned into Brick Lane. And once I started, I couldn't stop.
Okay, that's interesting. So this is when you started writing Brick Lane. Yeah. I was just about to ask that Brick Lane is about Nazneen, the central character, who is an immigrant in East London. So what inspired you to write a story about Nazneen? Where did you get the inspiration from?
Yeah, I think having children of my own made me more interested in that side of my heritage and curious about it in a way that, my father would tell stories about the village, for instance, and I'd roll my eyes and, oh, God, not this one again. And, it was just so tedious for a teenager, and I didn't want to be different. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to know it. And then when I had my own children, I started thinking, well, something is going to be lost here, right? My dad's not going to be around forever, and it's a side of me that I want to find out more about. So I started actually asking for those stories, and I started getting curious about the Bangladeshi communities, because they're varied, in the UK. And once I decided to start writing about that, I started researching in earnest. And the obvious place to set the book, though I didn't grow up there, is Tower Hamlets, is Brick Lane. So So I started going and talking to people on the estates, talking to youth workers, social workers, women's centres, people in restaurants. Or, I did a lot of, people love telling their stories.
Yes.
So there was that, and then I did a lot of paper research, library research. There was a very important book by a Bangladeshi academic called Naila Kabir. It's titled The Power to Choose. It's about garment workers in the East End of London and in Dhaka. I was a very important inspiration for the book. Naila was very generous with her time with me. So all of those things came together to form the basis of Brick Lane.
Because Brick Lane is a very historic place for a lot of Bangladeshi immigrants. This is where they started their lives when they came to London. So, yeah.
Exactly. So, I mean, for those people who haven't read it, it tells the story of Nazneen, who had an arranged marriage at a very young age. She's grown up in a little village in Bangladesh, and then she's suddenly transplanted into Tower Hamlets to a man she's only ever seen a photograph of. He's a much older man. It's rather pompous, although quite endearing as well, character. And it's about her life, and she goes on to have an affair with a much younger man, also within the community. So, yeah, that's a sort of basic outline of Brick Lane. But one thing that I will add is that, inspiration for books doesn't always come from the obvious places. So one inspiration for Nazneen was actually my mum's experience. And as you know, my mum is English, born and bred. But she had kind of the opposite experience of
going to Bangladesh.
Exactly, yes. Of going to Dhaka, going somewhere where she didn't know the language, she didn't know the culture, she didn't know much about their religion, she didn't know anybody. And she went there to get married to my dad. And that sense of utter social and cultural dislocation, that sense of alienation, of seeing everything through a sort of very, almost like an alien's eyes, to seeing everything afresh, was very much what I had in mind when Nazneen sees anything from a zebra crossing to, whatever it might be, a shop front, is it was drawing really on, the way that my mum has always spoken about the way that she saw everything afresh going to a totally different place.
Yes. In Brick Lane, there is an incident when Nazneen's father disappears for 3 days.
Sorry, say again?
In Brick Lane, there is an incident where Nazneen's father disappears for 3 days. And when Nazneen wanted to know about his whereabouts, her mother said, if God wanted us to ask questions, he would have made us men. And being raised in Bangladesh, I do identify with a lot of these issues you have mentioned in Brick Lane. After 2 decades of writing Brick Lane, if you were to write Brick Lane again, do you think Nazneen's fate would be any different? How far do you think the Bangladeshi society or community has come when it comes to gender discrimination?
So how far has the Bangladeshi community come? There is no one simple answer to that, and I would have to go and do my research all over again to answer it, in the genuine depth of knowledge that it requires. And of course, in some ways, leaps and bounds. There is no doubt that changes have been made, but also I'm the patron. I mean, the reason that I'm here today is because I'm patron of an organisation called Hopscotch Women's Centre, which is in Camden, and it serves communities of underprivileged women in the area, including a lot of Bangladeshi women. And I know that not all the issues have gone away or been resolved. I mean, they do a lot of work around domestic violence, for instance. They do a lot of work around getting women into education or employment. Some of the issues have changed. as in sometimes men who've come here and have made a success, they've built up some money and, you know, bought their own house or whatever, they've then abandoned sometimes the original wife and taken
Yes.
a new wife.
Yes.
And then the first wife, Hopscotch will help them to do very simple but very necessary things like how to get the bus, how to use money, how to order in a cafe, you know, all of the things, because they've led a cloistered life, they've not been allowed or able to do. So there's change and then there's not enough change. I mean, one of the important things that Hopscotch is doing, and I they're such a brilliant, innovative, forward-looking organisation. One of the things that they're doing currently is a new project to work with boys and young men to talk about positive masculinity, to talk about respect and consent and all of those issues, because you have to intervene to break the cycles.
So men need to be educated.
Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. And also supported emotionally
Yes.
and, you know, help to understand how they're trapped in those gender roles as much as the women. But it's, you know, I would just urge anyone who has the inclination to go find out a little bit about Hopscotch. They've got to stand up in that room because it's such necessary work. They also said that I just found this out today, that they've now offering therapy, culturally sensitive therapy sessions, especially family therapy sessions, when you're talking about gender roles and gender discrimination in Bangladeshi families. I mean, one of the things, you know, it might be if you're having a family therapy session, it might be that actually the elder brother has a lot of power.
Absolutely. I mean, I experienced it in my own family. The male family members, they always have the opinion, and their opinion is always valued, and the female family members are not valued equally.
Exactly.
Yes.
Exactly. So, you know, it takes some sort of cultural knowledge and understanding to be able to work with the families in those situations. And I think, you know, you understand that very well.
Yes, sure. So a lot of us know that the Brick Lane, that book was later on made into a film. I'm very interested to know that at that time there was a protest in East London, and interestingly, not a single woman participated in the protest. So why do you think the protest happened? Do you think your book upset the Bengali community or the men?
Yeah, I think it. I think it was a handful of older conservative men who didn't really like the portrayal of a woman having an affair with a younger man. I mean, there was. I do remember one person who was interviewed saying, "Oh, you know, these sorts of things shouldn't be talked about, and, you know, it will give a bad light to the community." But actually, you know, there were very few people involved in the protest. And I remember Sarah Gavron, who's the film's director, ringing me up and saying the numbers of people, from local people who were queued up to be extras in the film, you know, it was like 100 to 1. I mean, so it was very small, and it was inflated by The Guardian and a few other newspapers. But yeah, it was a sort of storm in a teacup, but it did leave a bad taste in my mouth, and it took a while for me to understand how well the book had been received by the people who'd actually read it within the community. That took a while to sink in.
Right. So did it have any how did it affect you, the protest? Because you didn't do writing for 10 years.
Oh, no, that was totally unconnected and
No.
much later. So yeah, I think the only way that it affected me really was that it annoyed the hell out of me that, papers like The Guardian had picked it up and sort of almost, I felt, tried to inflame it. And I mean, what happens when you give priority to those older male conservative voices, the people who already have the power in those communities, and make them the representatives and the mouthpieces, is that you further disempower the people who are already marginalised, in this case women, within the community. So that enraged me. But other than that, it probably helped to sell more books,
Okay. So your love marriage came out after 10 years, so it was quite a long wait. And love marriage is truly engaging, entertaining, and relevant. All the components of modern identity are laid out in the story: race, class, gender, faith, sexuality. You explore generational and cultural tensions, as well as contemporary political issues such as Islamophobia, NHS underfunding, and Brexit. How did you get inspired to write such a complex yet entertaining story?
That's the kind of question I like. I actually was working on 2 different stories, and I wasn't sure which one I was going to end up writing. And one was about Yasmin, who is a British Indian of Indian descent, who's a young doctor who works in a London hospital, and she's engaged to be married, and it was all going to be about her and her boyfriend. And then I had this other story that I was working on, which was about, she wasn't called Harriet at the time, she's now called Harriet, but she's a North London liberal, lovey, lives in Primrose Hill, public intellectual, feminist, and rather full of herself, but also, quite endearing as well, I think. And writing is like 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. But I did have this light bulb moment when I thought, what if I put them together? What if these 2 different worlds came together? What would happen? And I thought that would be fun. And then I just couldn't, I couldn't stop writing. So that's how the book came about.
Would you like to give us a taster from the book, read out?
Sure.
Yeah.
It's going to be interesting with the mic and the book, but I'll give it a go. So I'll just read what sort of 40 pages, and we just lock the doors. No. I'll read for like 2 minutes. Don't worry. And right from page 1. In the Gourami household, sex was never mentioned. If the television was on and a kissing with tongue scene threatened the chaste and cardamom-scented home, it was swiftly terminated by a flick of the black box. When Yasmin began her first period, her mother had slipped her a pack of Kotex maxi pads and murmured instructions not to touch the Quran. This was confusing because Yasmin never touched the Quran anyway, except at the behest of her mother. But it also made sense because menstruation, as she had learned in a biology class, was linked to reproduction. And the dotted line diagrams in the textbook were surprisingly, yet undeniably, linked to the actors who pushed their tongues into each other's mouths, thus ruining everyone's viewing pleasures. Now, at the age of 26, Yasmin knew all about sex. The human body had long since yielded its mysteries. She had slept with 3 men and was engaged to be married to the third, Joe, a fellow doctor at St. Barnabas Hospital. Her parents, Shokat and Anisha, liked Joe because as a doctor, he was automatically suitable. And because everyone liked Joe, he was gifted that way. If Anisha longed for her daughter to marry a good Muslim boy, it was an opinion she kept to herself.
Wonderful. I have to say, growing up, that was exactly our household. And at 21, I thought you could get pregnant just by kissing. And it's true, you know. So that is spot on.
That was a textbook for you then.
That was spot on. So yeah, very interesting characters in Love Marriage. Also going back to the women's issues, I just want to ask you that I find Yasmin's mother, Anisha's character, very interesting, because when we start reading the story, Anisha appears to be a Bengali mother and a wife who is seen to be a caregiver. And same goes with Nazneen in Brick Lane, that everybody perceives her to be a caregiver, a mother, and a wife. But these women, they have aspirations in life. And so why do you think that Bengali women often find it difficult to come out of this gender role that is perceived for them?
Yeah, well, Anisha is. I mean, she's quite a lot of fun as a character because she's eccentric and she dresses oddly and she's always starting, you know, bodge DIY projects and she's sort of, you know, a semi-comic creation, but everything is filtered through Yasmin's perspective.
Yes.
So she loves her mother deeply, but she's also a bit embarrassed about her. And as much as she thinks of her, she thinks of, you know, she's mum in the kitchen and she's cooking and she's distributing food and so on. And Anisha begins a friendship with Harriet, and Yasmin has been sort of horrified at the prospect of the families meeting. You know, she's in agonies about them coming together, but in fact, there is no culture clash whatsoever. Harriet delights in Anissa and takes her under her wing, and this friendship develops. And Yasmin's very skeptical about it. She feels like Harriet is exoticizing Anisha. She's treating her like a pet. You know, it's another thing because she collects stuff and she's collecting Anisha in that way. And quite early on, when Anisha's been out with Harriet, Yasmin says jokingly, "Oh, so she's turning you into a feminist, is she?" And Anisha says, "Oh no, I'm already a feminist." And Yasmin just laughs, right? She can't, because she can't see her mother as anything other than mum.
Yeah.
And I mean, I don't want to give too much away about the plot because, you know, things are revealed quite later on in the book about what a truly remarkable woman
yes,
Anisha is. So, you know, in this case, it's not that Anisha has allowed her life to be ruled by expectations. On the surface, it looks that way, but in fact, that's not the case. but I've got this circumlocution because I don't want to give too much away. But the fact is that she is a really remarkable individual, and that's not, that hasn't surfaced even for her.
But the family members, they fail to see this. Like, women can be more than mothers. Women can be more than wives. And this is what you have portrayed, both in Love Marriage and in Brick Lane, that women are not just caregivers.
Absolutely, and each individual is. I think it's easy to walk past a brown woman in a sari and not grant them their true individuality and we have as complex an interior life as anyone else, and I think one of the things that fiction can do and must do is open up different perspectives. I mean, it's like walking a mile in another person's shoes. You see the world in a slightly different way. You become aware in a slightly different way. And there have been studies that reading fiction increases empathy, and empathy is like a muscle. The more you exercise it, the stronger it gets. So I think, those are some of the reasons that I write as well.
Right. So Love Marriage is great. Talking about love marriage, and arranged marriage is not forced. So why do you think that in Western society, arranged marriage has become an obsolete concept?
Well, have you seen this program called Married at First Sight?
I have, yes.
Oh my God. I mean, of course, I would never watch trash TV, so I don't know what it is, but I've heard about it. I mean, it's really fascinating, isn't it? All these, there are all these like dating programs now with experts putting people together, and Married at First Sight is just one. I can't remember the names of all of them, but I watched them. My excuse is that I watch them with my daughter, and then we gossip about everyone. But there's a panel of experts and matching them, and then they have to meet each other's friends and family and so on. And you think, well, that's sort of like an arranged. The downside is it usually doesn't work out, right?
Yes.
There's too much choice because all they've got to do is get their phone out and see that there are other options and what they think might be better options. I mean, neither system is perfect, but I don't think people here know what even love marriage means. I mean, it's not a term. So when Love Marriage came out last year, I did some interviews with Indian media, and of course, they all know what love marriage
yes.
means, but here it's sort of meaningless. I mean, in the whole of the subcontinent, marriage is for 90-odd% of people still, it's arranged marriage. So that's just called marriage. And the thing that the minority does is called love marriage.
Yeah.
Whereas here there's no such thing as a love marriage. It's just marriage or arranged marriage. So that shows the sort of the depth of the difference. But I don't know, what do you think?
Well, I agree what you said. And interesting observation for me is in Bollywood, in the Indian film industry, most of the story is about love marriage, because when a boy likes a girl and then the family, they're like, oh, I don't, maybe a rich man likes a poor girl, or a rich girl likes a poor boy. Or, the most of the Indian film industry, the story, that is based on love story. Because when two people like each other, the family were like, oh no, we don't like your choice, so we cut you off, or, so I think what you said is so true, that in Bangladesh or Indian subcontinent, marriage is arranged marriage, and anything other than arranged marriage is called love marriage. Yeah.
Exactly. And, and of course for film, as in any kind of form of fiction, the basis of it is intention and obstacle, right? You want something and then you put an obstacle in the way. So it's an ideal plot. But I also think that, to draw on British culture, Jane Austen was writing about engagement and marriages, and that was the driving force for all her plots. But through that, you can see a whole lot about society at the time. In Jane Austen's novels, you get to learn a lot about, how power works, money. She's very precise about money, about the position of women, about all sorts of social and cultural issues. And I think now, even though we're in a very different multicultural landscape, when we go out to work, Yasmin's a doctor, I still think that all the customs and expectations and rituals that go around an impending marriage are still a very good lens for looking at wider issues within society. And that's what I think I do in Love Marriage.
Amazing. What's next? When you think about what's next, what comes to your mind?
Well, at the moment, I'm chairing the Women's Prize for Fiction. It used to be called the Orange Prize. It's now called the Women's Prize for Fiction for next year. So I've got 70-odd novels to read. So that's a lot, and I'm trying to write at the same time. But it may be a little bit of time before the next book hits the shelves.
And are we expecting Love Marriage to be on the TV?
Oh, gosh. It's so frustrating. It was, I don't know. The BBC commissioned it, and then the commissioning editor left, and then the head of drama left, and then they parachuted in someone new. So it's fingers crossed, but I'm not feeling very hopeful at the moment. But you never know,
Sure. Thank you, Monica. It was a wonderful conversation, very insightful. And the floor is open to question and answer. Yeah.
Thank you for speaking to us. It was very interesting. It comes up, if you Google you, it comes up with something like writer's block. It took you a long time to write, after Brick Lane, to write something again. Do you think if Brick Lane maybe had not been as successful, it would have been easier for you to write something else? Maybe it would have been like a slow burn. You got some good reviews, but it wasn't a global success. It would have been easier for you to write something again and have like a slow burn career, instead of this amazing thing all at once, you're known globally, and explain like what writer's block actually is to you.
Yeah, I don't really know what writer's block is. I did write after Brick Lane. The question still stands, is it difficult to have a very successful first novel? And the answer is yes, it is. I also know it's difficult to have an unsuccessful first novel, and I know which I'd rather have. So, I feel very lucky, actually, that Brick Lane not only was successful at the time, but it stood the test of time. It's now an A-level set text. It's reaching new generations of readers. It's it's found a place around the world in the diaspora and also beyond. So I think there was that I have had moments of sort of shut up about that already, I've had enough, let's talk about something else. and this sounds so spot, but it sort of gets old and it gets a bit boring if you can't, because I've got lots of interests, right? I've got, there's a book that I researched where I was fully invested in, and so, but then I want to move on because I'm a writer. I'm not a professional Bangladeshi. I'm a professional writer, and I had other things that I wanted to write about and talk about and move on to and research. And it was frustrating to feel that that wasn't allowed in some ways, that I was expected to do more of the same, that I wasn't allowed my full breadth of my full expression of myself. And that's eventually what led me to stop writing. But when I wasn't writing, I got depressed, So it was hard to write, and it was harder not to write. That's what I discovered in the end, and that's why I went back to it, and that's eventually... I didn't stop writing for 10 years. It's 10 years since my last book came out. I spent 4 years writing it. It was a much longer in manuscript. It was 240,000 words, which, don't worry, it's not now. I cut it in half. But, it was a long process to write, so I was about 4 years. And then I was also raising my family. I was tired. I was exhausted. And I was depressed for a while, but not for that 10 years. It's just a 10-year gap between my last book and Love Marriage.
I think it's good to hear it from your voice as opposed to what everybody else has to say, so thank you for that.
Oh, pleasure.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to say I loved reading Love Marriage, and it was the kind of book that when I finished, I was actually sad because I missed hanging out with those characters.
Always leave them wanting more.
You did.
That's full of showbiz.
And I have so many questions, but I wanted to ask actually something that came up in my book club when I was reading this book was about the generational aspects and age. And when I was reading, I found that Joe and Yasmin seemed really young. And I mean, Joe's therapist calls him the boy when we're first hearing about it. And it just seemed like they're kind of these two people putting on adult clothes and bumbling around. And I just wanted to hear your insight and if that was intentional and your thoughts on writing those characters. And I say that as kind of a young person also bumbling around.
I'm still bumbling around. I mean, I think we're all still bumbling around on the inside. So when you get it from the inside, that's how it feels. It's interesting that you raised the question about the therapist, because Sandor, the therapist, was my solution to the problem of Joe. So Joe is Yasmin's fiancé, and he is a sex addict, and I wanted the reader to feel close to Joe and not judge him too quickly. So originally I was going to write some chapters from Joe's perspective, and I thought that, that's just not going to do it. I need us to understand him from the therapist's perspective only. And the therapist is an older guy. I mean, he's heading towards retirement. Of course, he thinks of him as a boy in the same way that I think of my son as a boy, and he's a man. But it was important that, sex addiction, what's that? Is it real, or is he just he's a dick, So, so I needed the reader to understand Joe, that actually what he was suffering was an addiction and the way that he was suffering. So that's why we get him through Sandor's perspective, and that's why he's a boy.
I really enjoyed your book. I listened to it on audio, so I didn't read it, I listened to it.
How was the reading? Because I can't listen to my own books on audiobook.
I enjoyed it, but there were some, what happens when you listen, it's harder to reread. Like sometimes I'll reread something that I enjoyed. And I just want to comment, I loved your sex murder scene. I just loved it. I loved it. I thought it was just, the question really would be, do you ever feel self-conscious writing things like that? Because, then people start thinking, it's so personal, that type of a scene, right? I mean,
It was horrific. Just let me say, for those people who haven't, it's not a sex murder, actually. I haven't gone over to the dark side. But, so it's a period sex scene. And Yasmin's, so I'd written about an affair before. This is, but with Nazneen. The protagonist of Brick Lane. But when Nazneen has an affair, it was in keeping with her character that I could just close the door at the point that she steps into bed. I didn't need to go there, all right? But with Yasmin, her sexual journey, because, on page 1 of the book, it's like she knew all about sex, she knows all about everything. No, she doesn't. So it's part of her development as a character is recognizing her own desires, recognizing how much she's been constrained by other people's expectations, by denying herself, all of those things. So when I came to write it, it was actually fine. It was actually a lot of fun. The only problem came when I sent my daughter, who was at university at the time, a proof copy of the book, and she rang up a couple of days later, said, I'm really enjoying it, Mum, it's great. And then she rang back a couple of days later when she'd read the period sex scene. She was like, Mum, how could you? Don't you know Grandpa is going to read this? Yeah. Reading my dad. I was like, okay. Oh, my God. Yeah, but if you write with somebody looking over your shoulder, you are stuffed.
Right. But you started with a period, don't touch the Quran, you've got your period, and the sex period scene was more like, hey, bring it on, whatever, right? Let go.
Exactly.
And so I like that. I just wanted to share that with you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. That was really interesting. I think maybe we all think we have a novel in us, but most of us don't actually put pen to paper. So I was interested when you said it took 4 years. And 2 questions, really. Was that kind of daily writing? And how do you even begin to structure a novel when you've never written one before?
So 2-part question. Was it daily writing? Yes. When I'm in a novel, I try and write every day. It's not always possible, right, with whatever else is going on in life and the children and the whatever. But I do try and write every day if I can. It's also something that's bubbling away like all the time. So if there's a problem that I can't solve, I'll go to sleep on it and I'll be thinking about it in bed. I might wake up with the answer. I mean, that's often how it works. Or I'll go for a walk, take the dog out, and something reveals itself. But it also means, application of seat of the trousers to seat of the chair. You can't wander around endlessly looking for inspiration. It's work, right? You have to sit down and work. What was
The second one, sorry, was how do you structure a novel when you've never written one before? How do you learn that craft?
Read. I mean, you can go on creative writing courses. I've taught on creative writing courses, but, I hate to think that people think that they have to pay, huge amounts of money on I've taught on MFAs, MAs. It's a lot of money, right? All you need is a library card. Yeah. All you need to do is read. I never went on any of those, but you have to be a serious reader. Yeah. I mean, I tell you 3 things to become a writer: read, read, and read, and you can work it out. And preferably have something to say.
Can I ask you, please, about your literary influences? Whom do you admire, writers today or before?
Yeah, I mean, I was really formed as I think we're often forged very young as readers and writers. So although I never had any thought of becoming a writer, those adolescent reading experiences, I think, is where you really become forged. And I spent a lot of time reading the classics. I mean, Jane Austen is a writer I still go back to. George Eliot, Middlemarch, my favourite books ever. But also lots of men. I mean, I love Tolstoy. I go back to Anna Karenina of War and Peace time and again. I like Balzac and Flaubert, and some writers I can't go back to. I mean, Zola, for instance, I tried to revisit a couple of years ago, and I loved all of his books, and now I find them so overly melodramatic. So some writers that sort of fall away, but some still are absolutely my formative influences. Also, I would say V.S. Naipaul, so House for Mr. Biswas, for instance. Also loved Graham Greene, Muriel Spark, Beryl Bainbridge, who I discovered about the age of 18. She was like a breath of fresh air, just fresh, spare, funny, vicious, just a wonderful, I think still underrated writer.
Hello. I congratulate you because I also have a mixed marriage in me. I've been married to my English husband for 53 years. And I'm sure I'm going to adore your book because for that, for how, you have been through. What I wanted to say, because you call this book that I have bought, and I'm so glad I have done now, Love. And I wondered if you have read Love in the Time of Cholera.
If I've read...
You have read the book Love in the Time of Cholera.
Oh, Love in the Time of Cholera. Yes, I have, yes.
I mean, that for me, because I love writing as well, but short story different to you. I stopped with that club now where we used to write and all that, for years. And because love is also explained there in such a, if you like, romantic way, this love that doesn't really suffer age or separations or anything like that.
Sorry, what? Could you repeat that?
Sorry, I think it's my accent. I think that for me, Love in the Time of Cholera has really, for me, has been an opening, about how love can be.
Yes, yeah.
Yes.
No, it's a wonderful book, and I love all of Garcia Marquez's books.
Yes.
Yeah, they're absolutely
Garcia
wonderful.
Marquez.
Yes.
Thank you.
I'd love to know how long it took you after you'd written your book before it got published. And was it very frustrating, or were you very fortunate?
This one, or my first one?
Yes.
The first one. No, I got very lucky indeed. I'd written 5 chapters, and I didn't belong to any creative writing groups, or I didn't have any